Because of that, yeah, because of that, bear with me. I'm just going to reintroduce myself. But I'm Jay Coughlin with Nuclear Watch New Mexico. Thank you all for joining this briefing. With me are my staff members, fellow staff members, Scott Kovac and Sophie Stroud, plus Dr. Michael Ketterer, Professor Emeritus of chemistry and biochemistry out of Northern Arizona University. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Scott to, first of all, briefly walk us through what is Intellus. So take it away, please, Scott.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Yeah, these maps that we've made are based on the Los Alamos National Laboratory's environmental database called Intellus, New Mexico, and the link is on some of the handouts that we sent around. It's a publicly accessible database, and they claim that there's over 16 million records, including more than 32,000 locations and about 400,000 samples recorded in this database. The records include, oops. Recent and historical information about samples for the laboratory uses for air, soil, sediment, biota, and water. It's the one thing about the database is that it's kind of it's just like a data dump. Most of the data is kind of out of context, and it's up to the user to try to figure out what's going on. I'm going to bring up a spreadsheet here from them. This is an example of what kind of information you can get. This one was a simple query for plutonium samples, plutonium that showed up in samples for the year 2021. So this is just the year 2021, and the important column here, I resorted this by report results and from high to low. So the high you can see here is for 2021 is 10,100 picocuries per gram, and it goes down from there. And you can also see that most of these are detects for the first part here, for all these larger numbers. It's when we get to the smaller numbers that they start showing up with non-detects. That's what these ends are for right here. Also over here is the latitude and longitude. This is, how here and here. This is the latitude and longitude. This is how we get the points on the map. And this is how Sophie, made the maps. And so Intellus is I mean, for as big a database as it is, 60 million hits, 16 million samples. That's a lot. And I will say that it is they do have trainings for Intellus, and the laboratory does have the staff is very friendly if you call them up and ask a question about Intellus, but it's just very, very cumbersome if you don't use it a lot, and it takes a while to figure it out. Should we go to Sophie?
Yeah, Sophie, if you can begin to address the map and pull it and share screen it, please. Sophie, you're muted. Sophie.
Oh, so sorry about that.
Well, I
Okay,
did that yesterday, but please take it away.
thank you, Scott. I'll go ahead and restart. Okay, so this is our map. We have a front page and a back page. So the back page describes the map, but I will go ahead and describe it briefly as well here. So as Scott stated, we have all our samples from Intellus database. And we originally gathered all samples of plutonium from this database, and those ranged from 1970 to 2023. And there were over 100,000 samples for all plutonium in Intellus. So from there, we filtered out surface samples. So this map is only showing samples that were taken below ground. After we filtered out the surface samples, we were left with approximately 60,000 samples taken below ground, and those dates ranged from 1992 to 2023. And then out of that data set, we sampled out plutonium fallout background from nuclear weapons testing, and we did that based on two criteria. If a point had a sample end depth, which is another column in the spreadsheet Scott just shared, they have a sample start depth and sample end depth recorded for each point. So if a point had a sample end depth that was recorded as being within 6 inches below the surface and had a report result of 0.054 picocuries and below, the sample was presumed as being plutonium fallout background and therefore was removed from our data set. So this map you're seeing here is all plutonium fallout background from nuclear weapons testing is presumably not included in this map based on the criteria I just gave. And so you can see all these different points, and then these insets, we isolated a couple different, 4 different areas, tech areas of the Los Alamos lab, and looked at the deepest samples within those areas. And those insets are the graphs of those samples. And there's a legend up here. The blue line is showing the water table and the groundwater aquifer. And there's a time legend here for when the samples were taken. And looking forward to questions on this map, but I'll go ahead and share our other version, which is an interactive map.
Just a second, Sophie, if I could add one gentle correction. At the beginning of your remarks, you said we removed all soil samples, and let me clarify. We were trying to filter out what Los Alamos lab could argue is background fallout from nuclear weapons testing. So we're trying to isolate what appears to be actual plutonium contamination from the laboratory. And to do that, we filtered out, and I stress that this is a combination. It's not either or. We filtered out samples that were less than 0.054 picocuries per gram and less than 6 inches deep in the soil. So I just want to make clear why we did this one filter. Again, to repeat, it was an attempt to screen out background fallout from nuclear weapons testing and isolate it to what is arguably contamination from the lab itself. So thank you, Sophie. If you can, one additional item this is for the sake of emphasis in the inset graphs, that blue line is the water table. the deep groundwater aquifer. So we are talking about plutonium detections and so-called non-detections below the surface of deep groundwater. So that's a point we really want to drive home. The reason that it's at a little bit of an angle is because the top of the water table is measured relative to sea level, and the water table actually falls in gradient from west to east. But again, that is the deep groundwater aquifer. All right, Sophie.
Perfect. Thanks for that clarification, Jay. So we have this interactive map as well. And just to preface this a little bit, we built this as an extension of our map, but also as a tool for the public to be able to look at Intellus data in a more kind of digestible and user-friendly way, because as Scott mentioned, it's somewhat of a data dump and kind of hard to wrap your head around. So that was the kind of purpose and intention behind this interactive version. And I'll take you through it a little bit. So when you load it, there's plenty of data, so it takes a couple seconds to load, but shouldn't be too long. But when you first enter the map, the layer that is automatically showing up is plutonium 239, 240 single samples. So we have plutonium 239, 240, and plutonium 238 in 2 different layers here. So you can see the single samples and then also the multiple samples. And I'll just describe what this means a little bit. So the single samples are just samples that were taken one time. There's no overlap in any of the lat longs. They're just individual samples. But the lab has also taken samples, duplicate samples or samples at the same location over time. So if you zoom in, you can click and zoom in on some of these groups here. So I'll just show you for an example. If you click on a group, you can kind of see this one was taken December 4th, 2002. And you can kind of go around to the different points. So they took 4 samples at the same location at the same date here. So you can kind of look and compare the report result, the sample end depths, sample types, all that stuff, and the dtext for 1 point. And then as well, there's other groups that show kind of samples over time. So 2004, 2006, 2007. So some of the lower ones may be taken at the same time or
Wish
not.
I could, if you can figure out how to turn up the volume.
And you can go ahead and reset the
have the
map.
Loudspeaker.
And we have the same situation for plutonium 238. If you click the top layer, it enables all of these. And same thing for plutonium 238. And
Come on in.
we did save
listening to
the
a webinar.
data
Oh,
from
On
the
plutonium migration. Oh,
from the filtered out.
Some of you all need to mute. Please mute in the background. Thank you.
From the filtered out data that we based our static map on, we kept the background fallout data that we filtered out. And you can see that on this map. So the plutonium 239, that is just background from what we found. Plutonium 238, background from what we found, and you can enable them both. And I think probably the last thing I want to point out, we have a feature where you can see the dtext and non-dtext. So as I mentioned, after filtering out the plutonium background fallout, we ended up with around 58,000 samples. And the ratio of what the lab says are detects versus non-detects of this data set is approximately 30% and 70%. So 30% of the 58,000 are labeled as detects, 70% are labeled as non-detects. And you can look at this kind of visually here. So the plutonium 239, 240, these are the detects, and these are the non-detects. So just one more time for 239, 240, detects and non-detects. And you can see visually the difference. It's actually even more striking with the 238 detects, non-detects. So you can kind of think of these four as one layer, the no fallout layer between both types of plutonium. And you can kind of just filter different, you can just filter differently within those layers. And then there's the background fallout layer alone for each. And the difference between the detects and non-detects is going to be elaborated on by Michael Ketterer. So I'll pass this along to him for further elaboration on the LANL detection methodologies. Michael, you're muted as well. Yeah, perfect.
There we go. Good morning, everybody. I'll just reintroduce myself. My name is Michael Ketterer. I'm an analytical and environmental chemist. I am in a semi-retired capacity right now. I'm Professor Emeritus of Chemistry and Biochemistry at Northern Arizona University. I do analytical work and field work studying plutonium and other actinides in the environment. And as Jay said at the beginning, I've done quite a bit of this on a number of sites, nuclear sites around the US. I mostly do field work and lab work investigating these constituents in the environment. Last year, about July, I opened up a file on New Mexico. I've got a bunch of data here already on samples that I've collected and analyzed myself from New Mexico. So I have some perspective on this whole issue, but I've gotten into this with Nuke Watch New Mexico in the map, and I want to particularly applaud Nuke Watch for coming out with this because it's really a nice tool that the public could use. And I found it extremely useful in gaining my own understanding of this vast, complex site. So I've had the privilege to work some with Jay and Scott and with Sophie in the development and beta testing of the map. And my comments are mine, and they are not Nuke Watch New Mexico's comments. I am not being paid. I wish to say I'm not being paid by Nuke Watch New Mexico for appearing here today, nor for conducting any of this work over the past months. I am here out of my own volition as a private citizen and as a private researcher. I am not necessarily talking to Los Alamos National Laboratory or its contractors. More specifically, I'd say I'm talking to the people of New Mexico about the lab. So I'm not talking to the lab, I'm talking about the lab. So once again, I really want to applaud the Nuke Watch map. And I'll tell you here today about a couple of environmental concerns that I got directly from looking at the data on the map. But I want to refer everyone to my letter of April 23rd, 2024, to James Kenney, the cabinet secretary for NMED. And in that, I've summarized my review comments on what I'm seeing from the Intellus New Mexico database. And as an analytical chemist and speaking with as somebody with 20 plus years of experience in studying plutonium in the environment and also its analysis, with the caveat that I have not done a great deal of alpha spectrometry. I'm using something instead called mass spectrometry, which is explicated in my comments, and which I think if Los Alamos were to adopt that, or if the state of New Mexico would request that to happen, then a lot of the problems I'm talking about here today would be alleviated. I'll refer you to my written document, and page 2 has kind of a summary of my comments. If you go, yes, perfect. Thank you, Sophie. Go down one more page, please. There we go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'm contending here that from what I see in Intellus, LANL is not following best accepted scientific practices in how it uses detection limits. It's not explained. There's many things that any sensible analytical chemist would thoroughly question. And in terms of comment number 2 there, I'd say one of the most troublesome things here is the great inconsistency in detection limits or apparent detection limits that you see in the Intellus New Mexico data. And it creates this gray area where it's impossible for someone, either the lay public or someone like me who presumably can read and interpret this stuff, it's impossible for us to know the truth of the matter. Is plutonium present in this deep borehole at such and such a depth, or is it not? That's now a gray area because of the features in number 1 and number 2 here. Instead, I'm recommending that Los Alamos should be compelled to use mass spectrometry. Los Alamos cannot tell us that they lack this capability, and Los Alamos has been doing this since before I was born. And I refer in my document here to some peer-reviewed publications with LANL authors where they are doing exactly this. So as a result of not using mass spectrometry, there's a lot of environmental monitoring situations, such as the water in the Rio Grande in 2011, 2012, 2013, near the Buckman intake for the Santa Fe water system. You know, there's numbers on Intellus that are 3 picocuries per liter, and some of them say, yes, it's detected, and some of them say it's not detected. So which one is it, guys? This is not something that should be in an analytical database that I, as a federal taxpayer, help pay for. So in terms of, if we could go back up to, I want to touch on number 4 here. One of the things I'm also troubled by, and this became much more evident in reviewing the map, was that there's an apparent practice where a value of 0.054 picocuries per gram is being used by LANL. This is in an MDAC site investigation plan that goes back about 20 years. But this value is being used as kind of a, it's called a BV or a FV, a background value or fallout value. And it's not, it's pretty apparent from context. That's what's being done is if plutonium 239 plus 240 are present at levels below that, then it can automatically be dismissed and ascribed to background, i.e. it came from fallout. Fallout meaning stratospheric fallout from 50s and 60s nuclear weapons tests, and specifically not LANL plutonium. This is completely erroneous, what is being done here. I think I could use the word fraud if I wished. What should be done instead is LANL should cease to use the term FV/BV. It should cease to compare numbers to this standard. If LANL wishes to say anything on-site or off-site is other than LANL plutonium, LANL should come forth with mass spectrometric data that show that it is fallout, and it has a 240/239 ratio of 0.18 and not somewhere down around 0.05. So we are left with a picture of obfuscation, and I have basically specifically addressed this to the state of New Mexico. We need better as people out of the laboratory for how the offsite monitoring is being done. And I think the laboratory should be honest with the state of New Mexico and its citizens about which plutonium is from it and which is from fallout, and should cease using terminology such as shown in bullet number 4. That pretty much concludes my remarks. I will pass it back over to the Nuke Watch team.
Jay, you're muted.
I keep calling this a rookie mistake over my inability to unmute, and you'd think after 30 years I'd be able to do it. But Zoom's only been around for 8, right? There's some small details. First of all, the literature that we're talking about, including the map, including Dr. Ketterer's letter to the Secretary of NMED, they're all on the website, the NukeWatch website, which is www.nukewatch, that's NUKEWATCH.org. So you will find those documents up there. One thing I failed to mention in my introductory remarks is we'll conduct Q&A for as long as you all ask questions. And in a lot of ways, I like Q&A the best. So we'll take what time it takes for any questions that you might have. And then just on some very general remarks, I want to describe NukeWatch's underlying motivation in preparing this map. And for starters, we wanted to demonstrate that plutonium is migrating. And of special note, and Michael as a chemist can speak to this more in great technical detail, but of all the elements and of all the contaminants, plutonium is relatively slow to migrate. It tends to, or it needs to kind of hitchhike on mud or colloidal particles, et cetera. And again, Michael is the expert on this. But if we're finding plutonium down in Cochiti Lake, and if we're finding plutonium in the deep groundwater aquifer, NukeWatch thinks it's obvious that this should be of great concern to northern New Mexicans. And then we want to take it a step further and declare that this is compelling evidence of the need for comprehensive cleanup at the laboratory. And I say that in contrast to the so-called cap and cover that the laboratory wants to do, leaving more than 200,000 cubic yards of toxic and radioactive waste permanently buried in unlined pits and trenches. And there's a very current case in point at what's called a material disposal area. I prefer to call it a dump, but known as Area C, for which the New Mexico Environment Department has issued a draft order, still has to go through a public hearing, et cetera, but a draft order directing DOE and Los Alamos Lab to comprehensively clean up Area C. Now, I want to mention the money is that DOE estimated about $12 million to cap and cover Area C. The estimate for full cleanup is over 800 million. Now, I can't vouch for the accuracy of those estimates, that's beyond NukeWatch's control. But to me, that helps illustrate the gravity of the issue. Are we going to have genuine cleanup, or are we going to have expanding nuclear weapons programs gobbling up all that money And the nuclear weapons programs at Los Alamos have more than doubled in money over the last 10 years, while DOE actually proposes to cut cleanup funding for fiscal year 2025, the next fiscal year. So the news that there's plutonium contamination in Cochiti Lake, that's not new news. That's been long known. There are lab studies on that very issue. The Environment Department's DOE Oversight Bureau has long reported on it. So again, that's not new news, but nevertheless, it's not generally known by the New Mexican public. Now, with respect to us finding plutonium detections and quote non-detections in the deep groundwater, that data's been around for a while, but I will suggest that what is new news is publicly calling that out. We don't hear about it. And this is a groundwater aquifer that a large portion of northern New Mexico depends upon for drinking water. So to sum up, it's Nukewatch's position that comprehensive cleanup is imperative at the laboratory, especially in the face of expanding nuclear weapons programs. And I'm not being purely cynical in pointing out that comprehensive cleanup would also generate hundreds of high-paying jobs for generations. And that'd be a real win-win for northern New Mexicans, permanently protecting the environment while providing high-paying jobs. Now, with that, it's time for Q&A. And as I previously stated, we like Q&A. We'll take as long as it takes, but we're going to initially give priority to any reporters, any media. So if y'all would please self-identify and unmute yourself. And media is first up, and then we'll go on to others.
This is
So,
Mike
Andy-
with the Santa Fe, New Mexican. I do have a couple questions. I think you answered some of them there in the last bit. One that I did want to ask was, why were there, I think it said little to no samples taken by the labs after about 2008? Do you know?
I would say you need to ask the laboratory. And of course, you know, Nukewatch is going to argue that there should be comprehensive sampling on an annual basis.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. I also wanted to clarify. So you've already talked about the questioning, basically the suspect non-detects and the need for LANL to report why they found those as non-detects. But do you know, like, do you feel certain that plutonium has migrated to the underground aquifer and surface water sources? Or is this simply raising concerns? Like, how much certainty do you have that this has happened?
You know, we're not going to be declarative and say that this is absolutely happening. You know, for starters, Nukewatch is not taking the actual samples. Again, all of this data comes from the LANL environmental database, Intellus. As I said in my earlier remarks, our overall motivation was to demonstrate migration. And in that sense, the precise quantities are less important to us than whether the migration is actually occurring. Now, what I think is a controversial issue, or should be, if publicized enough, is the issue of detections versus so-called non-detections. You've heard Dr. Ketterer's critique of it. I mean, it should be clear he has massive expertise in the subject. But, you know, in a way, I'm going to dodge your question by saying, ultimately, this is the laboratory's responsibility, not Nukwatch's. It's the laboratory's responsibility. Now, in the back page to our back explanatory page to the map itself, I want to cite two historic incidents in which I have some personal experience. Or actually, I'm going to cite three for why we should not trust the laboratory. And the first is, as late as the 1990s, the head of Los Alamos's groundwater monitoring program was claiming that groundwater contamination was impossible. And the argument was that volcanic tuff is impermeable. That's the word that's used. And that is true. But what Los Alamos overlooked, and I can't help but feel that it's intentional, the Pajarito Plateau is one of the most geologically complex places in North America. It is highly fractured. And there are many pathways for contaminants to reach both the perched, alluvial, and the deep groundwater aquifer. I was going to cite two other incidences in which I feel the laboratory was highly dissembling, but I think I'll skip it for now for the sake of brevity. And if you have any other questions, Maya, please ask.
Thank you. Maybe I'll ask one more and then open it up to other people's. I'm imagining myself reporting this and I just want to zoom out. I don't know if this is in your expertise, but I want to ask, like, does the plutonium migration mean that groundwater and water in the Rio Grande could be unsafe to drink currently or in the future? How much should people be worrying about that?
The specific case in point is the Buckman Direct Diversion Project, which, you know, uses surface water from the Rio Grande. And there is actually contamination in the Rio Grande, somewhat clustered right around the Buckman Direct Diversion Project. That said, there is no indication that the Buckman's final product, that being, you know, pure drinking water, has been compromised. We have no evidence of that. I drink that water as well. And, you know, you'll never find Nuclear Watch being, you know, Chicken Little running around saying that the sky is falling. So I think our drinking water is safe. I do want to mention one, on the other hand, and this is in our back page. In 2013, a severe storm wiped out a Department of Energy monitoring station for stormwater events that was at the confluence of the Los Alamos Canyon and Rio Grande. And that monitoring station was meant to alert the Buckman Diversion Project to close its diversion gates. So again, that was in 2013. DOE refused to restore that monitoring station even after repeated requests by the Buckman Direct Diversion Project, and did not restore that monitoring station until March 2023 while settling a cleanup lawsuit brought by Nukwatch, New Mexico. So I'm saying two things. I believe the drinking water is safe from Buckman, but don't trust DOE. Do not trust the Los Alamos National Laboratory to act in our best interests.
Thank you. Can we go to Tom patiently?
Let's stick to media. Is there any other media?
Yeah, this is Hannah Grover with New Mexico Political Report. Going off of the last questions, are there any concerns about private drinking water wells in the area?
I don't think that we can answer that. I will note that they shut down one production well, Los Alamos County production well, because of the chromium plume, not because of plutonium. But I can't answer you directly about private wells.
I have a question. This is Alicia from Searchlight, New Mexico.
Yes, Alicia.
Hi, so it looks as if this, map is really sprawling and there's a lot of different sites here. My question has to do with potential exceedances of health and safety standards. And I just wonder if you can characterize how many places on the map outside of lab property could exceed health and safety standards or limits, if you have any idea of what that percentage could be. Is it many? Is it, less than a certain amount? Just some kind of characterization.
Well, that's a tough question. And because it's tough, I want to punt that to Michael. Can you do that, Michael?
Sure. Thank you, Alicia, for the question. There are examples. I'll qualify my answer by saying that I'm not a toxicologist, I'm a chemist, but I can probably in a general way say that something like 10,000 picocuries per gram of plutonium-239 plus 240 in a soil sample is dangerous stuff from the viewpoint of inhaling alpha emitters. It says so in a general chemistry textbook. At any rate, dodging, being a health effects guy, I would say that there are examples in the database of Los Alamos, both in water and in soil, that raise concern with respect to this. The trouble, I think, is that what really are the MCLs, the maximum contaminant levels for plutonium in water or plutonium in soil or sediment. So I'll use some for comparison. The state of Colorado. State of Colorado has a water standard of 0.15 picocuries per liter for plutonium-239 plus 240, which is part of the Rocky Flats legacy management agreement. In the off-site environment, there are examples that exceed that threshold. That threshold is presumably health-based. I do not know or can't comment on really where that came about, but it is a standard that is in effect. The Buckman inlet area that we were talking about earlier, there are data in Intellus that show concentrations of plutonium in the water and report them as yes, this is detected, that are on the order of 1 to 3 picocuries per liter. So they would exceed that standard. It's my understanding that New Mexico has a guidance or voluntary compliance standard of 1.5 picocuries per liter that applies to the Rio Grande. With respect to in soil and things like that, here are some examples. At the Beaumark base cleanup in New Jersey, the Air Force used 8 picocuries per gram as a health-based cleanup standard. At Rocky Flats, it was 50 picocuries per gram. The state of Colorado has a standard on the books of 2 DPM per gram, which is 0.9 picocuries per gram, as being a level at which people should wear respiratory protection. If like you're disturbing this dirt in constructing something, you should do that. If I look at the whole LANL website and all of the data, which I've really only, by website, I mean Intellus, I'd really just scratch the surface of that, but I can cite many examples of both water and soil that would be well above those levels of concern. Los Alamos Canyon is full of contaminated sediments. It's no mystery why we ought to see some detection events like we did in the Rio Grande, considering the water coming down Los Alamos Canyon. It's, particle associated mostly, but I think that this is this is evident in the Intellus data, despite the fact that it's, you know, you have to figure it out for yourself.
Now, if I could add to that, and this is mentioned in our back page, but we found one instance, and Scott, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's from the year 2021 or 22, but in any event, there is a data entry that records 10,100 picocuries per gram at a location a half-mile north of the Los Alamos High School. And we're not able to precisely pin that down, the micro location. Now, needless to say, that's pretty concerning. It's possible that it is an office or storage for DOE environmental management at Los Alamos, but it's not on lab property itself. But I would say this is indicative of one of the weaknesses of Intellus. You get raw information, you get latitude and longitude, you don't get precise location. And, you know, to be candid, Nuke Watch doesn't quite know what to make of this, but I would submit that 10,100 picocuries per gram would be a health concern, whatever it is, on non-laboratory property. And in a way, it asks more questions than it answers. Just to be a little more alarming, we did not note this in our back page, but apparently in 2019, at the same location, according to latitude and longitude, there was an astronomical reading of 7.65 million picocuries, but this was per liter, not per gram. So what is that? We don't know. But clearly, we're talking about a high dangerous level there. And again, it raises more questions than it answers. Okay, any more media? And seeing none, Tom, you've been patient. If you have a question.
Well, thanks, Jay. I certainly agree media gets precedence, but I have two questions. You talked about plutonium migration in groundwater and indicated you don't have quantitative data. I'm wondering if you have qualitative data showing plutonium migration in groundwater.
Well, actually, we do have quantitative data, and it's not ours, of course, it's Intellus. But, you know, some of that stuff is quite small in terms of picocuries. And this is where that issue of so-called detections versus non-detections is critical. And you've heard Dr. Ketterer, you know, pretty seriously question the laboratory's methodology. But I will repeat what I said earlier. We set out, Nuke Watch set out to demonstrate migration. And in a certain sense, the fact that things are moving is more important to us than the exact quantities that are being recorded. And the exact quantities, of course, are subject to debate. And I'm going to repeat and reiterate that plutonium as a contaminant is relatively late in the game to migrate. There's going to be other contaminants that would migrate much more quickly. Some of them are now well known, even though the laboratory used to deny that groundwater contamination was even possible. But look at your tritium contamination, your perchlorate contamination, and your chromium, and especially chromium contamination, which is huge in the deep groundwater aquifer.
Okay, thanks, Jay. The other question is this. Some years ago, I was talking to the head of the Jemez Pueblo Environment Department, and he told me that under contract to LANL, Jemez maintains a filter in the Valles Caldera to collect radionuclides specifically. They maintain that filter, they collect the product, and apparently they send it somewhere for analysis. And I didn't get a close enough look at your map to see if you have data from that site. So two questions. Are you aware of that site? And the other is are they still doing it?
No, we're not specifically aware of that site. Again, Intellus gives locations as latitude and longitude with little, if any, description beyond that. And don't overlook the obvious, initially we're dealing with up to 100,000 different samples. So we filtered as described for background fallout, et cetera. But Intellus, and I personally don't deal with Intellus. It's Scott and Sophie, but I feel their pain. It's very cumbersome, a huge amount of entries, et cetera, et cetera. So no, but if you were to look at our map, which again is on the website, I will say that there are certainly sample entries. Well, you can see it right there in the Valle Caldera National Preserve. What the specific location is, I don't know. Oh, and one clarification though, the little triangles are peaks, are they not, Sophie?
Yes, and that actually brings me to something I forgot to mention. There's a couple different map views you can do. I like this one because if you zoom in, it has tech areas labeled. But these orange and red triangles are a little bit confusing with the rest of our maps. So yes, those are peaks. You can also do this view, which is a little bit different, maybe more clear because it doesn't have those options. And there's a satellite view as well.
Excuse me, what do you mean by peaks?
Oh,
Elevations.
Mountain peaks.
you
Oh,
can see like
you mean
Pajarito Mountain
topographic
there.
peaks.
Yeah.
All right, and then lastly, Jay, I gather you haven't been aware of this program that LANL had with Jemez and, for all I know, possibly with other pueblos to maintain this filtering system.
The funny thing is, I'm acutely aware of it. That is called, well, they're called the Accord tribes. That it's Cochiti, Jemez, San Ildefonso, and Santa Clara. And I was involved in litigation in 1996 against the Department of Energy. And all I will say is that the Undersecretary of DOE came running out here about 4 months after various discussion to sign these accords with the 4 pueblos that I've just mentioned. So the 4 pueblos have had that environmental monitoring program, subsidized by the Department of Energy since the late 1990s. So yes, I'm aware of it through personal experience.
Do the pueblos other than Jemez, whom you named, do they maintain these filtering systems?
Well, I don't know specifically about the filtering systems. They're probably something like AirNet that collects samples from the ambient air.
Yes.
Again, I won't know specifically, but it's likely. And the 4 pueblos, have their own environment departments, in part subsidized by the Department of Energy through these, what's called these accords.
All right, thanks.
Any more questions? We'll be disappointed if we don't have a lot of questions.
There's a question for me from Kathy Helms in the chat.
Yes, Michael, if you could read the question and address it.
Okay, a question for Michael Ketterer from Kathy Helms. Hi, Kathy. Good to have you on the call. This seems to be epidemic. Is there a comparison that can be made with the presence of plutonium at LANL and plutonium in the Nolichucky River and attics in homes in Irwin, Tennessee, sites in Paducah, Kentucky, and Portsmouth, Ohio? Thank you. Thanks, Kathy, for the question. We could talk for the rest of the afternoon about the common threads among the sites you've named as well as others, but I think the common thread is the main common thread is that there's a lot of contamination that has escaped off site of actinides, and by that I mean things like uranium, enriched uranium, depleted uranium, naturally occurring uranium, whatever, as well as substances like neptunium and plutonium, and they've been spread around in a multimedia fashion through the water, through the air, and they've wound up in the soil and the sediments and groundwater, and that is true of all of these places. And I would also like to tell everybody here on the call today, we talked a little bit about transport of contaminated sediment down Los Alamos Canyon and so on and into the Rio Grande. Let's not forget sight of the fact that Los Alamos had a lot of air emissions of plutonium in the 40s and the 50s that landed right in the community. And that is something that I think people that live in Los Alamos really need to wake up to. Los Alamos, the town of Los Alamos, is a little mini Rocky Flats. And unlike Rocky Flats, which was built with the nearest houses, maybe not anymore, but the nearest houses several miles away, people live very close to where the production areas, or lived very close to the production areas at Los Alamos. So I think the people in New Mexico, and particularly if you live in Los Alamos, you better think about that.
If I'm going to add a couple of things, first of all, Alicia Guzman with Searchlight New Mexico had that incredible article a couple months ago about how a worker at the laboratory, but he was from Truchas and came back on weekends, I take it, but his mother-in-law washed his clothes, and that woman ended up with these incredibly high depositions of plutonium in her own body. Nevertheless, she lived to be 90, but just giving a shout out to Alicia on that particular story, but I'm using it to indicate, how plutonium can be transported. And needless to say, things were worse in the earlier days than they are now. I will observe that. But a final general comment I want to make on plutonium fallout. Some of you may be aware that there was a proposal to actually define a new geologic era, E-R-A, and call it the Anthropocene. That basically means heavily impacted by humans. And the marker was going to be the presence of plutonium in geologic strata around the world. This is global fallout. And now my next remark is not limited to plutonium. It's for fallout, period. But the American public and the global citizenry, I think, are unaware of the fact that most of the deaths are yet to come from fallout from atmospheric testing that ended in the early 1960s. And this is primarily due to carbon-14. which is a fission product, but unlike the others, is particularly long-lived. So I'm going to repeat that. Most of the deaths from fallout, cancer deaths, are yet to come, and we're going to experience that for a couple of thousand years. And just to add to that, and here we are in a case here in the land of enchantment where the Trinity test downwinders have yet to be compensated. Okay, we got another question in the chat. This is from Jean Stevens. She asked, what about Las Conchas, Cerro Grande fires and other fires in 2000, etc., polluting nuke and possibly plutonium across northern New Mexico? I'll attempt to answer that, Jean. Now, first, the Las Conchas fire came right up to State Highway 4, which on the west side, the western boundary of the laboratory. And thank God, and the Conchas fire, Las Conchas fire, was successfully stopped there. That was in 2011. So I don't think that's of great concern. The 2000 Cerro Grande fire, however, is a different matter, in my opinion. You may recall that the laboratory and the town site, they were both evacuated because of that fire. There is an air monitoring system called AirNet. And guess what happened? They clogged up, personnel left. We got nothing from AirNet. The one occasion that it really should have worked, we got nothing. So basically, I can't answer you, Gene, what the impacts were, what the, you might call it, fallout was from the Cerro Grande fire. It's not known. I will add, that, I'm not a radiologist or anything. I'm just telling you my general understanding, but you can expect a lot of naturally occurring radionuclides to be in wildfire smoke, particularly potassium 41. But I'll state it again. AirNet failed us when we most needed it during the 2000 Cerro Grande fire. So I will leave it at that. Somebody asks why there is not a representative from LANL at this press conference. If there is one, or from the cleanup contractor, please so state. We didn't specifically invite them on our part, but nor have we kept them from coming. So that's my best answer to that. I see that Chilton Tippin has a hand up.
I think Diane too has been waiting.
Excuse me, Diane was before you. Then we'll get to you, Chilton. Diane, please.
Hi, I wanted to ask if either Dr. Ketterer or somebody there can, clarify what most of us know, but I'm not sure that it's ever it's reflected all the time in media, that there is no safe level. And, so what is the so-called legal versus safe level for plutonium? And then, so that I would like some comment on. And then also I had a question about the reporting that you were doing on detect and non-detect, and those maps that were showing lots of non-detect. And is non-detect because there was a chosen level below which the instrumentation is not reliable? Or, could someone elaborate on what non-detect means? And then third is having worked with people around Oak Ridge, one of the retired Tennessee Department of Environment Conservation experts he really brought home to me the idea that all of these Department of Energy weapon sites are immense concentrations of radionuclides. And if you just think about the concept of entropy over time, you can't trust that it's going to all stay there. And what he was conveying to me is a picture of all of this eventually dissipating out from the dozen weapon sites and other nuclear sites. And so if we're having even an indicator of something starting to leave, doesn't action leave the site, doesn't action need to be taken? So sorry for such a long series of 3 questions, but that's what I wanted to hear.
Can you address that, Michael? But I'll point out, just to put things in context and why this issue of detections versus non-detections is so important. This is approximate, but 30% of the data entries are described by the laboratory as being detections, and up to 70% as being so-called non-detections. So this issue is crucial. But back to you, Michael.
Thank you, Diane, for the question. I think I'll try to address your second one there about the detection limits and what are we really looking at and what does this mean in the map. The Los Alamos database in Intellus, New Mexico, it appears to be plutonium activity measurements that are mostly measured by alpha spectrometry, and DOE and their contractors are following Hassel 300, I believe it is a DOE methodology. And one of the, I would call it a weakness of this methodology, is in order to get really good results and to produce the detection limits that the technique is inherently consistent, capable of, one needs to count for a long time for low-level samples. And that would include a lot of these off-site water samples, deep borehole samples, samples of soil that might be near this so-called fallout value, background value, that sort of thing. But what appears to happen in the Los Alamos database is the alpha spectrometry experiment, the measurements themselves are being manipulated at the level of the laboratory. I'll use the word manipulated because I think what's being done is the counting times for the alpha sources are made artificially short. So that will raise the detection limit. Instead of counting it for a week, they'll count it for 20 minutes and say, I'm exaggerating.
Can you say that again? Can you say?
The results of alpha spectrometry are subject to being manipulated. The detection limits are subject to being manipulated by choice of counting time. If you count for a short period of time, the detection limits on a picocuries per gram basis, picocuries per liter, will be much higher. And therefore, if one wants to not detect something, there is a way to do that. And you know, I'm not accusing directly anyone of doing this in the Intellus NM database. I'm just saying that there's a lot of results where the detection limits are suspiciously much, much, much higher than they should be and what the technique is capable of. And as a result, there's a big gray area of uncertainty in the low-level data. Is it really there or is it not? You can't really tell that from these data. And it's for these reasons I am imploring everyone here to use mass spectrometry. It will cut through the ambiguities and also demonstrate on a sample-by-sample basis what the apportionment is between LANL and background plutonium. Background meaning from 50s, 60s stratospheric fallout mostly.
Michael, I'm asking you a clarifying question because now I'm a little confused. But you said with shorter count times, the detection levels will be higher. And
Yes.
yeah, but another way of putting it, I'm asking if I'm correct. If the count times are lower, then the so-called detected quantities would be lower. Isn't that correct?
No, it's the inverse. To detect a low activity, a very low concentration in becquerel, picocuries per gram, for instance. Let's say it's 0.03 and it's in a borehole, and we want to really know, is it there or is it not? We prepare an alpha source, and then what one should do is count that for as long as possible. I know laboratories, my friend Wojtek Miatelski in Krakow in Poland, he counts alpha sources for 2 weeks when it matters. And what I'm saying is that if the alpha source is counted for a shorter period of time, the rate of decay of a very low level sample is too small to really register any counts. Therefore, the radionuclide is not detected. I see, hints of this in the LANL database. I will say that in the Portsmouth gaseous diffusion plant database on Pegasus, there are some much more blatant examples in that.
Okay, thank you. Chilton, you had a question?
Yeah, thank you for putting this presentation together and creating this map. I'm Chilton Tippin. I'm from Amigos Bravos, and I had a question also about the MCLs and kind of what has been found. And correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Ketterer, but I think I heard you say that down at the Rio Grande, there were some samples that had detections on the order of 1 to 3 picocuries per liter. And I'm pretty sure that in a recent triennial review, the Water Quality Control Commission accepted a standard of only 1.5 picocuries per liter for the Rio Grande itself. And so my question then is that if we have now found that there are detections at the river as high as perhaps three picocuries per liter, and that exceeds this standard by the WQCC of 1.5, I wonder if you all think that this could trigger some sort of regulatory action.
Thank you, Chilton, for the question. The Intellus NM database does indeed have a handful of samples which are apparently detects, and I have caveats. I've expressed plenty of caveats today about whether something is detected or not. But if we take it at the face value, LANL is reporting some detected events, and these are back in 2011, 2012, and maybe there's one in 2013. But they are indeed on the order of 1 to 3 picocuries per liter. I'm familiar with the 1.5 picocuries per liter. I guess we'd call it guideline or recommendation. It's not. It's my understanding it is not a state enforceable standard. But I make of this that we don't really know the answer here. What I think does happen, and this is my opinion as someone who's looked at plutonium transport and fate a little bit, I think what happens is that each year there will be some episodic storm events. There'll be a lot of water coming down at times through Los Alamos Canyon and other contaminated canyons, and there'll be a pretty good amount of suspended contaminated sediments. So plutonium contaminated sediments will be picked up. And it probably should be pointed out that most of these readings are probably what is called total, meaning, this could be a mud water mixture, and you're also measuring all of the suspended load there. I guess from the standpoint of a horse or a human drinking right out of a river, it doesn't make any difference. It went into your stomach. But in most cases, I don't think the plutonium is dissolved. It's suspended, but it's being transported as fine solids in the river. I think the thing to do from the standpoint of the public and from the state of New Mexico, and, LANL and N3B, you guys can go do what you want. But what I think the state of New Mexico should do is it should do its own independent monitoring and look for those episodic events. And I think they will show up. I think this year's monsoon season, we'll see a series of those. it's inevitable. As Diane Dorigo said earlier, you know, the plutonium is going to be eroding and being transported off of this site until the end of time.
Any more questions?
Yes, Jay, I have a follow-up for Michael.
Please.
Michael, when you were talking about the effect of the counting time on the sampling process, is there no standard counting time or for sampling, say across the world, or a consistent time for the Intellus samples?
Tom, I'm not going to say that I've read the letter of Hassel 300 to say what should be done, but it's my understanding that that's a decision that's made by the laboratory in consultation with the entities submitting the samples to the radiochemical laboratory. It's my understanding that a default count time, and I visited one of the labs in Fort Collins, Colorado, about 4 or 5 years ago, and talked to some of their staff. A default counting time is often 4 hours. And my remarks here are basically that from what I know of alpha spectrometry, when one wants to use it for low-level samples, one needs to count a much longer time than 4 hours. 4 hours is a formula for not detecting something that may be there at lower levels. And I do know that the generally accepted practice of all analytical chemists anywhere is if you have the horsepower to detect it and it matters, well, gosh darn it, that's what you go do. And that's not what I'm always seeing here.
Thanks.
Any more questions? Well, I have one for you, Michael. And Chilton brought up, you know, whether or not there's a regulatory enforceable standard, but knowing that you have extensive experience with the Rocky Flats plant in Colorado and the relevance of Rocky Flats to here, Los Alamos should be obvious to everybody. We're talking plutonium pit production. But with your experience around Rocky Flats, how is it that the state of Colorado ended up with an enforceable standard? And should that be the model for something similar here in the state of New Mexico?
I can't really give you the history of where this 0.15 picocuries per liter water standard for plutonium in Colorado came from. I do know that it is an enforceable standard that was promulgated by the state, and it's enforced by CDPHE, Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. It is pretty much exists exclusively because Rocky Flats is there. And my sense is that this is a standard that the state wanted out of abundance of caution, following up in the 1970s on the public disclosure of offsite contamination at Rocky Flats. And I think an abundance of caution brought about that standard. And then during the cleanup negotiations of the Rocky Flats site, it was agreed upon by US EPA, Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, and by the DOE. And it's part of the Rocky Flats Legacy Management Agreement. So now it is enforced. When water, surface water draining the Rocky Flats site exceeds 0.15 picocuries per liter, which happens fairly regularly and episodically also, then there is a what's called a contact record written up. DOE has to acknowledge it and has to explain it and has to tell the public about, you know, preventative measures, how we're not going to do this again. So now in New Mexico, there's no such standard. I'll just ask the question though, this state is going to have a new pit production facility and you don't have a drinking water standard or a surface water standard for plutonium?
And apparently not. So. Well, I guess we can wrap things. Oh, go ahead, Tom. And again, we encourage questions, even by the same person, but everybody,
Okay.
we encourage questions.
Jay, if I may, I have one more question for Michael. And this is kind of a squirrely question in the sense that it's too vague, but I have a geophysicist friend who was involved in the cleanup at Rocky Flats. And he asserts that Rocky Flats was very well cleaned up. Can you discuss that a little bit? Was it not? Were the standards just too high? What's the status up there?
Well, for anyone on the call who's not that familiar with Rocky Flats, it was, of course, the government's pit production facility from 52 to 89 and became quite contaminated in the surface environment. And by about 2007, as you said, Tom, there was a so-called cleanup completed. I would call it more of a removal action than a cleanup. The contaminated buildings were removed. There's a central operating unit, which is still a Superfund site. If it is allegedly cleaned up, why is there a Superfund site active still at the core of it, which has a remedy which is failing? What has been left behind in the cleanup is soils of up to 50 picocuries per gram on the surface. And, as I said, I'm not a health effects guy, but in my mind, those are much, much, much higher than can be reasonably expected most other places in the earth. And I can say from my own knowledge that they are full of PuO2 particles, those contaminated soils. And this is both on the central operating unit, on the refuge, and off of the site property. I'm not going to say that it's hurting anybody because I don't have the expertise to say that, but I'll add to this that at the central operating unit, there are no thresholds of activity that were remediated more than like 2 meters below the surface. So there's contaminated stuff deep down below. And as Diane DeRigo was saying earlier in the call, if we think that this is going to be good for the next 250,000 years, I think we're being very short-sighted. That stuff has to stay in place where it is for the next, 10 half-lives or so of plutonium-239. I don't think it will.
Michael, you said something is failing there. Can you elaborate on that?
I'm going to see here if my colleague John Lipsky is still on the call. I saw him earlier, and I would refer that question to him. And if John, you're not there, I will try to say what I know about that.
And I don't see that John Lipsky is on, but I do want to mention he was the FBI agent that led the raid in 1989 on Rocky Flats, and he's now a close colleague of Michael's. But have at it, Michael.
So what I'm referring to in a failed remedy is that since the central operating unit is still an active Superfund site under the legacy management agreement and under Superfund, it needs every 5 years a so-called 5-year review. The most recent 5-year review has cited that the site has stated that the site remedy is failing because they are out of compliance with PFAS. PFAS flowing away from the site. And back in 2018, DOE basically steadfastly refused to even investigate PFAS, but CDPHE forced them to.
What is PFAS, Michael?
Oh, that's perfluorinated and polyfluorinated alkyl substances. These are those forever chemicals, fluorinated chemicals that are very water soluble. And US EPA has just promulgated a water standard. And I was just reading the other day that there's a site in New Mexico near the New Mexico National Guard station that's got a groundwater PFAS problem. But that's the reason, it's my understanding, Tom, that's the reason that the remedy failed. And
Oh,
so,
okay, it's not radionuclides, all right.
well, yeah, I'll just leave it at that. It was the PFAS.
Thanks.
All right, any further questions? We'll take as long as it takes.
Could I ask, I have one other quick question that I don't know if you are the experts on, but if you can speak to it, what are the health risks of drinking water contaminated with high levels of plutonium?
Can you speak to that, Michael?
Only in the most general way. Plutonium is an alpha emitter, and its various isotopes. There is one that is a beta emitter, which decays to plutonium-241. Alpha emitters are considered most dangerous when they're ingested or inhaled. And so that is direct internal exposure. It may not be uptaken by the body. It remains a question as to how much of it is absorbed. I am not one that bears expertise in this topic, but I will point out that there are alpha activity, gross alpha activity drinking water standards, which are actually quite high. There are separate standards for radium, and then there's examples like in Colorado, this 0.15 state promulgated standard.
Tom, another question?
Oh, well, I forgot to put my hand down, but let me just make the comment and see if anyone if Michael or others of expertise disagree. I mean, isn't it true that no amount of radiation is good for the body?
I think that's most of our understandings. You know, the question is how much is too much, you know? Maybe zero.
You know, I'd like to point out that when the partial test ban treaty was being considered and, you know, was going to end atmospheric testing, but during that time, Edward Teller, who's director of the Livermore lab, he was essentially lobbying to have a new unit of radioactivity called the Sunshine Unit. And he was arguing for the hormesis theory, that a little bit of radiation is good for you. But I regard that as blatant propaganda, you know, to preserve the laboratory's ability for full-scale nuclear weapons tests. But Diane, I know you have some expertise in this subject and your hand's up. So what do you have to?
I wanted to point out that even the pro-nuclear National Academy of Sciences, in all of its reports on the biological effects of ionizing radiation, including the most recent one, indicate that there is no safe level of exposure to ionizing radiation. So that's what I was getting at in my question earlier, is that there may be legal levels. A couple of the reporters earlier were asking if it exceeded the legal levels. And even if it's at a legal level, it doesn't mean that it's safe, because any amount of radioactivity can initiate or accelerate cancer. And it was a very clever thing that the nuclear establishment did in the early days to only look at cancer. Since then, we now know from other pro-nuclear government agency admissions that radiation can cause ischemic heart disease. It can reduce immunity, making us much more susceptible to other diseases, in addition to cancer. And so I don't remember exactly what this question was that I was addressing here, but it has to do with no safe level. The reality is that there is no safe level, which is why I have a concern with the non-detect. Does the non-detect mean that it's a mistake to detect anything, or are they just saying that there might be some there, but it doesn't meet our threshold, in which case it's an indicator, could be an indicator that there is radioactivity migrating. And by the time it exceeds a legal level, it could be too late, because what we need to be doing now is remediating and preventing the release and taking active steps toward isolating it, because there is no safe level. And so any amount is going to cause injury, and then there's a government accepted amount of injury. You know, the EPA says 1 in a million to 1 in 10,000 people getting cancer is acceptable. The NRC regs allow 1 in 286 people to die from cancer, and that's legal. So, and the Department of Energy has also a pretty lax level that it says is okay, and it's different at different sites.
I'm going to ask Michael to revisit the issue of detections versus non-detections, but first let me note, I'm going to refer you all again to our map, but also the explanatory back page of the map that's on nukwatch.org. And in it, we explicitly point out that a non-detection does not mean that there's nothing there, and has more to do with what you were suggesting, Diane, can be below the sensitivity of the detection instruments itself. And then, as Michael has pointed out, has to do with the methodology too. Are there adequate counting times, et cetera? But again, Michael, you're the expert. If you could revisit that issue of detections versus non-detections. Again, it doesn't mean that nothing is there.
Sure. Thanks, Jay. And thank you, Diane, for bringing this up again, because I can see there's another element of this that I can try to explain to the people on the call here. The detection limit is like a statistical boundary between where the instrument or test that is being conducted is able to say, I am having a response that I can say corresponds to this substance is present, versus there's a response of the instrument, but it's not enough to surpass this threshold. So if it's the latter, then a decision is made with that statistical boundary, and the result is said to be non-detect or not detected. And in most of the world that I see, as someone who's taught analytical chemistry for 30 plus years, most of the world that I see, when a result is below the detection limit is quoted, it is reported as non-detected, and there is no number for a found concentration. That is unlike what LANL does with putting report results numbers in all of these columns. It is not standard practice to put in these numbers and say it's non-detect. It's meaningless. It's noise. It is a noise reading. The detection limit should be quoted, and it should be said that it is non-detect, or you can say less than with the mathematical less than sign, less than this value. What I think happens though is, and when you have a database that has this and you want to do something with this database, say conduct a risk assessment or whatever, the question arises, well, when a sample is not detected, there's no information. The analyte might or might not be present, but there's no information from the test to determine that. So if something like a risk assessment is to be conducted, the most conservative thing to do from a risk standpoint, protecting the people in the public health and the environment, the most conservative thing to do is to fill all of those non-detect values with the detection limit itself. It's to assume that that substance is present at that detection limit. And if say risk assessment was conducted in this manner, it would probably improve upon some critical situations where there just isn't information close to the detection limit. But it would also, I told you before, I'm an analytical chemist. It's my professional obligation. It's to do the best job that I can to measure something that might or might not be at a low level where it matters. It's my compulsion. I mean, it's sort of like if you come to me and say, I want to count this sample for 10 minutes, you're kind of, it's like you're coming to the ER and you're visiting with the ER doc and you are telling that ER doc not to do the best job that they can to save the victim from whatever affliction it is. You know, if detection limits are as low as possible, that provides the most useful insight. LANL is not doing the best possible job. They are capable of much, much better than this up there on the hill.
Tom, another question?
Yes, Michael, did I understand early on in the presentation here that for those data points on the map or for the data points in the Intellus database, that LANL backs out the amount of radioactivity that's kind of a standard for fallout? They back that out from the reading, and that of course reduces the reading, and that may take it below or into the non-detect category.
Not quite, but first, Tom, if I might ask, can you tell us your last name and if you have any affiliation? I've introduced myself on this call. Who are you? Can you tell us?
Oh, my last name is Lueben, Luebben, and I live in Santa Fe. In fact, I can see the lab from my bedroom window. And I've been active opposing the plutonium pit factory and the nuclear weapons modernization program. I'm a tribal attorney by trade.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, I appreciate, getting to talk to you today on the call. Let's see. I'm backing up. Can you reiterate what you just asked?
Yeah, just say, okay, so you go out, you collect a lot of data, you've got whatever levels. And I thought I understood from your presentation that LANL takes the samples, looks at the sample reading, and backs out a standard amount for atmospheric testing fallout.
Something like that. Here's what I can tell everyone about that. There is a value that is called a BV or a FV, background value fallout value. And I looked at a document written by the laboratory and its contractors 2003 or so for MDAC, some kind of a site investigations plan. And it had a bunch of tabulated data for these radionuclides. And the thrust of the numbers is, which I don't disagree with these numbers necessarily, the thrust of the numbers is this is kind of what you can expect from non-LANL sources in the environment. See, now there's nothing wrong with that. But what LANL appears to do with that 0.053 picocuries per gram for 239 plus 240. What they appear to do is they appear to say that if plutonium is detected at or below that level, it is not a matter of concern. It falls within the, the hash or the noise of the stratospheric fallout testing background. And my point on that is that, that's completely incorrect. I can tell you personally that I've measured samples that are from pretty close to the laboratory, not on their property, but close. And they have relatively low activities. They might be above or below that number, but 100% of the plutonium is from the laboratory. There's no way that you can say that this is a background number, and therefore, if we are finding plutonium in the environment, it didn't come from us. Doesn't need to be worried about. It's not an indication of transport of contamination. None of those things are true. Fallout is from a different source, and I think one of the things that Los Alamos could do to improve the public's understanding here is if they use mass spectrometry, as I'm describing, then they would have on a sample by sample basis an apportionment. This is how much of this sample came from background, and this is how much came from Los Alamos. It's automatically done in a test that separately measures the 239 and 240 isotopes. You ratio those. If you have a 0.05, somewhere around there, that's what's weapons grade plutonium characterizing the LANL stuff. And if it's 0.18, that's the global signal that's seen, as Jay was just saying, all over the world for the Anthropocene. On this, just before this call started this morning, I was calculating some PU data from somewhere else in the world, and it was from global fallout, and all of the ratios were 0.18. Near Los Alamos, they should be 0.05. Somewhere around there, characteristic of weapons grades. I think if we're seeing any high levels, it's reasonable to safely assume this must be from Los Alamos. That's common sense. A fifth grader could figure that out, I think. But the problem is really in this gray area where, we're approaching these levels or we're below these levels. The real information in the weeds is if we have a filter, so to speak, on our analytical work where we can separate the LANL stuff from the background stuff, then we are doing true science. The laboratory knows how to do that. There are staff scientists at LANL that have previously been my students, and none of them will disagree with what I'm saying.
Let me clarify one thing, Tom. It's possible that we're conflating things here. Sophie, in her interactive map, attempted to filter out what could be background radiation, plutonium fallout from atmospheric testing. And we did that according to 2 lab criteria. And to repeat that, it's the lab that says that below the quantity of 0.054 picocuries per gram and less than 6 inches deep in soil, that is fallout. Now, that is not going to be perfect. That is a general filter. Michael's indicated this. I mean, there's going to be probably some fallout that is deeper than 6 inches. But again, we employed this general filter to try and filter out fallout so that we can concentrate on laboratory contamination. But I'm going to emphasize that criteria, again, is both acting together. It's not or one or the other. It's below 0.054 picocuries and less than 6 inches deep from soil surface that generally can be considered to be fallout. And we're trying to be careful here, but at the same time, we're using imperfect instruments such as Intellus.
Well, then if I understand correctly, Jay, and Sophie, you folks backed out the fallout level.
Correct.
LANL has some other standard for non-detect.
Yes, those figures I cited, and particularly the 0.054, that is not the standard for detections. I'm not aware of a firmly stated standard for detection. And that seems to be a pretty important missing link out there.
You hit the nail on the head, sir.
So then in the database where LANL shows detection or non-detection, the standard for characterizing something as non-detect is not consistent at LANL?
I get the following impression, Tom, and you know, I'm an outsider looking at LANL's database, and I don't have infinite time to understand everything about it, but I'm getting the impression that what's being done with the 0.054 picocuries or 0.053 picocuries per gram is LANL tends to say that's the FV/BV. If plutonium is found below that level, it's within the range of what could come from background. Therefore, we have less to worry about here. We don't really even need to know. We don't need to worry about, detecting it unless it's well above this level. Those are the impressions that I get just from looking at their analytical work. On the other hand, there's some very curious groups of samples where it appears clear they want to prove that it's not there. So they take repeated samples and they get extremely low detection limits. And maybe they even detect it at some low level. But you can see the intonation. I would say the intonation exists in the results to the effect that when they want to prove that something is clean, they are able to do that. And when they don't wish to be able to say that something is dirty, they don't wish to have to say something is dirty, they try to sidestep it.
Great, thanks, Michael, and I appreciate the answers to my detailed questions. I have an undergraduate degree in geophysical engineering, so I have an in-depth interest in this.
Well, you are happy to send me an email and we can talk later in the future if you wish.
Thank you.
There's a question about Hanford and Columbia.
Yes, please address that, Michael.
Sure. So, hello, Robert. I don't have a great deal of familiarity with the Hanford site. Of course, I know it was a PU production reactor and the Columbia River became extensively contaminated, and it's, of course, isotopically distinguishable from Hanford versus from fallout. I am quite likely safe in assuming that that's been done and it is in a unclassified report. There is a sample produced by NIST called Columbia River sediment, which is from somewhere downstream, well downstream, and it shows a mixed isotope signature. Mixture of fallout in Hanford, i.e.
Okay, Tom, if you could lower your hand, assuming you're done. And if there's anybody else with questions or not. And then just to close, I want to say again, that the real credit for this presentation goes to Scott and Sophie. They worked very hard collecting the data. I know Sophie was up late last night working on another iteration of the map. And of course, we're very grateful for Dr. Ketterer's participation, giving this some technical heft. I'll say again, the underlying motivation of Nuke Watch and going through this multi-year exercise, by the way, was to demonstrate migration of plutonium, which again is one of the last contaminants to really migrate. So it's indicative as well of every other contaminant before us, before that, but concluding with the need for comprehensive cleanup at the laboratory. And towards that end, I will suggest that the New Mexico Environment Department's position of mandating comprehensive cleanup at the Area C waste dump is in the real interests of New Mexicans. So with that, I think we're going to close. I don't know about you all, but I have a selfish need to do so because it's lunchtime. And we had almost 2 hours of this with more than 50 people. So thank you all so much for attending. Again, the relevant documents, you're going to find it on www.nukewatch.org. And again, thank you for participating. And adios for now.
Thank you.
Thank you.